Hey guys, tonight we're going to explore what beauty standards were like in medieval times. This is going to be an extremely detailed, methodical examination of medieval beauty ideals, beauty practices, and appearance standards that will hopefully help you drift off to sleep. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare for a long, thorough, and decidedly boring journey through medieval aesthetics. To understand what beauty standards were like in medieval times, we must first establish how medieval people thought about beauty as a concept, which was quite different from how modern people understand attractiveness and appearance. The medieval conception of beauty was deeply intertwined with religious beliefs, social hierarchies, and moral judgments in ways that would seem strange and arbitrary to modern sensibilities. In medieval Christian Europe, which is the focus of our examination, beauty was understood as having both physical and spiritual dimensions. Physical beauty was acknowledged and appreciated, but it was viewed with some suspicion, as the Church taught that excessive focus on physical appearance was a form of vanity and pride, which were sins. The truly important form of beauty was spiritual beauty, which meant the beauty of a pure soul, a virtuous character, and a life lived according to Christian teachings. This created a complex and somewhat contradictory attitude toward physical beauty. On one hand, beautiful people were admired and were often seen as blessed by God, as beauty was thought to reflect divine creation. Beautiful saints in religious art were depicted as physically attractive, suggesting that holiness and beauty could go together. On the other hand, beauty was also seen as potentially dangerous, as it could inspire lust and could distract people from spiritual matters. Beautiful women, in particular, were sometimes portrayed as temptresses who might lead men into sin. The medieval understanding of beauty was also connected to social class. The appearance standards for nobility were quite different from those for common people, and these differences were not just about fashion or personal preference, but were seen as reflecting the natural order of society. Nobles were expected to look noble, to dress in fine clothing, to have pale skin that showed they did not labor in the sun, and to generally present an appearance of refinement and superiority. Common people, by contrast, were expected to look like workers, to dress simply, and to not attempt to imitate the appearance of their betters. These class-based appearance standards were enforced through sumptuary laws, which were regulations that restricted what people of different social classes could wear and how they could present themselves. These laws specified which fabrics, colors, and styles of clothing were permitted for each class, which types of jewelry could be worn, and even details like the length of shoe points or the height of hats. Violating these laws could result in fines or other punishments, and the existence of such detailed regulations shows how seriously medieval society took the visual markers of social status. The standards of beauty for women were particularly rigid and were connected to expectations about female behavior and female roles. A beautiful woman was expected to be modest, chaste, and obedient, and her appearance was supposed to reflect these virtues. Her beauty was not for her own enjoyment or expression, but was meant to be pleasing to her father, and then to her husband, and it was supposed to reflect well on her family. A woman who was too concerned with her appearance or who used cosmetics and fashionable clothing to attract attention might be criticized as vain or even immoral. For men, beauty standards were somewhat different and were more focused on signs of strength, health, and status. Rather than on delicate features or refined appearance, a handsome man would be tall and strong, would have a noble bearing, and would display the physical characteristics associated with his social position. For knights and nobles, this meant showing signs of martial prowess and aristocratic breeding. For clergy, it meant showing signs of learning and spiritual authority. For common men, standards were less defined as their appearance was of less social importance. The medieval period lasted for roughly 1,000 years, from approximately 500 CE to 1500 CE, and beauty standards evolved considerably over this long span of time. What was considered attractive in the early medieval period was quite different from late medieval ideals, and there were also significant regional variations, with different standards prevailing in different parts of Europe. However, certain themes remained relatively constant throughout the period, including the association of beauty with morality, the importance of social class in determining appropriate appearance, and the greater scrutiny applied to female appearance compared to male appearance. Understanding these fundamental aspects of how medieval people thought about beauty is essential before we can examine the specific physical features and practices that were valued. The medieval approach to beauty was not simply about aesthetic preferences but was embedded in a complete worldview that included religious beliefs about the body and soul, social beliefs about hierarchy and order, and gender beliefs about the proper roles and behaviors of men and women. Beauty was never just beauty, it always carried moral, social, and spiritual meanings. Chapter 2: Ideal Female Physical Features. Let us now examine, in exhaustive detail, the specific physical features that were considered beautiful in medieval women. These ideals varied somewhat by time period and region, but certain characteristics were fairly consistently valued throughout medieval Europe, and understanding these ideals helps us see how different medieval beauty standards were from modern ones. The face was considered the most important aspect of female beauty, and medieval ideals for facial features were quite specific. The face should be oval or heart-shaped, with a high forehead that was broad and smooth. The high forehead was particularly important and was so valued, women would often pluck their hairline to make their foreheads appear higher. This practice of hairline plucking could extend several inches back from the natural hairline, creating a forehead that would look strangely oversized to modern eyes. The eyebrows should be thin, delicate, and arched, following the medieval ideal of refined femininity. Thick or heavy eyebrows were considered masculine and unattractive. Women would pluck their eyebrows extensively to achieve the desired thin line, and some would pluck them away almost entirely and then draw on eyebrows in a thin arch using the emetics. The space between the eyebrows should be wide and smooth, contributing to the overall impression of a high, clear forehead. The eyes themselves should be large and bright, with a gentle, modest expression. The ideal eye color varied, but blue or gray eyes were often praised in literature and were associated with nobility and Northern European ancestry. However, dark eyes could also be beautiful if they had the right qualities of brightness and clarity. The eyes should not be bold or forward in their gaze, as this would suggest immodesty or lack of virtue. Instead, the eyes should be cast downward, demurely, or should look at others with a soft, gentle expression that reflected feminine submissiveness and purity. The nose should be straight and not too large, refined and aristocratic in appearance. A prominent nose or a nose with any irregularity would be considered a flaw. The ideal nose would be almost unnoticeable, simply serving as a delicate feature in the center of the face without drawing particular attention. The nostrils should be small and refined, not flared or wide. The mouth was considered extremely important in medieval beauty standards. The ideal mouth would be small, with lips that were neither too full nor too thin, but were described as being like rose petals or rosebuds. The lips should be red, though not with the intensity of modern red lipstick, but with a natural-looking rosy color that suggested health and youth. The mouth should be closed or smiling gently, never open or laughing loudly, as this would be considered unrefined and immodest. The teeth should be white and even, though dental health was generally poor in medieval times, and many people had discolored, damaged, or missing teeth by adulthood. A woman with good teeth would be considered fortunate and beautiful, but the mouth would typically be kept closed to avoid displaying the teeth prominently. The medieval emphasis on small, closed mouths meant that teeth, while important, were less publicly visible than in modern beauty standards, where smiling broadly is encouraged. The complexion was perhaps the single most important aspect of medieval female beauty, and the standards here were very specific and were quite different from modern ideals in many parts of the world. The ideal complexion should be extremely pale, almost white, with a slight rosy blush on the cheeks. This pale skin was a marker of social class, as it indicated that the woman did not labor outdoors in the sun and therefore was of noble or at least well-to-do status. Tanned or sun-darkened skin was associated with peasants and laborers and was considered quite unattractive. The skin should also be smooth and unblemished, free from freckles, moles, scars, or any irregularities. Freckles, which are caused by sun exposure, were particularly undesirable as they marked the bearer as someone who spent time outdoors. Women would go to considerable lengths to maintain pale skin and to remove or lighten any freckles or dark spots, using various cosmetic preparations that we will discuss in detail later. The neck should be long and slender, described in poetry as being like a swan's neck or a column. A graceful neck was considered a sign of nobility and refinement. The skin of the neck should have the same pale, smooth quality as the facial skin, and the neck should be displayed to advantage by the necklines of medieval dresses, which often revealed the throat and upper chest. The shoulders should be narrow and sloping, not broad or squared. Broad shoulders were considered masculine and undesirable in women. The medieval ideal of female beauty emphasized delicacy and smallness in the upper body, suggesting fragility and femininity rather than strength or physical capability. The breasts should be small and high, almost adolescent in their development. Large breasts were generally not valued and were sometimes seen as a flaw, as they suggested excessive physicality or fecundity that was not consistent with the medieval ideal of refined spiritual femininity. Clothing was designed to flatten and minimize the bust line, rather than to emphasize or enhance it as in many later periods. The chest should be flat and modest, with the breasts barely noticeable beneath the dress. The waist should be slender, and the torso should be long, creating an elegant, elongated silhouette. However, the extreme corseting and emphasis on tiny waists that characterize some later periods was not as pronounced in medieval times. The natural waistline would be emphasized by the construction of the dress, but there was less attempt to artificially reduce the waist through tight lacing. The hips should be slender and not overly curved. Wide hips, like large breasts, suggested earthiness and physicality that was not consistent with refined beauty. The overall silhouette should be sandal, narrow and vertical, emphasizing height and slenderness rather than curves. The arms should be slender and graceful, with small, delicate hands. Fat or muscular arms would be considered unattractive, as they suggested either gluttony or physical labor, neither of which was appropriate for a beautiful noble lady. The hands should be small, with long tapering fingers, and the skin should be white and soft, showing no signs of work or sun exposure. The legs and feet were generally not visible, as they were covered by long skirts, but when discussed in literature, or when visible in certain contexts, the legs should be long and straight, and the feet should be small and narrow. Large feet were considered a flaw and were sometimes used as a mark of low social status, as peasants who worked barefoot or in rough shoes would have broader, more calloused feet than nobles who wore proper footwear. The hair was extremely important in medieval female beauty standards and was subject to complex and changing fashion rules. The hair should be long, thick, and lustrous, and the ideal hair color was blonde or light brown. Golden blonde hair was particularly praised in Blitster and was associated with beauty, youth, and purity. Dark hair could also be beautiful but was less valued, and red hair was often viewed with suspicion, as it was associated with various negative characteristics including hot tempers and potential witchcraft. The hair should be clean and well groomed, though washing hair was a laborious process in medieval times and was not done frequently. The hair should be styled according to fashion, and hairstyles changed considerably over the medieval period. In some eras, young unmarried women would wear their hair loose and flowing as a sign of their virginity, while married women would cover their hair with various forms of veils or headdresses. The covering of married women's hair was related to religious teachings about modesty, as hair was seen as potentially sexually tempting and needed to be concealed in respectable married women. The overall impression created by all these specific features should be one of delicacy, refinement, modesty, and youth. The medieval ideal of female beauty emphasized smallness, palence, smoothness, and vertical elegance rather than curves, color, robust health. The beautiful woman should look like an ethereal, almost otherworldly creature rather than a strong, vital, physical being. She should appear fragile and in need of protection, reinforcing the gender roles that cast men as protectors and women as protected. Understanding these specific ideals in detail helps us see how culturally constructed beauty standards are. The features that medieval people found beautiful were those that fit their society's values and beliefs about gender, class, and morality. A woman who exemplified these physical ideals would be admired and would have better marriage prospects, while a woman who deviated from these standards would be considered less attractive and might face social disadvantages because of her appearance. Chapter 3: Male Beauty Standards. While female beauty was scrutinized more intensively and was considered more important in medieval society, men were also subject to beauty standards, though these were quite different in their emphasis and their social meaning. Let us examine what was considered attractive in medieval men and how these standards reflected medieval values and social structures. The male face should have strong, regular features that conveyed nobility and strength. The jawline should be firm and well-defined, not weak or receding. The chin should be prominent, suggesting strength of character and determination. Unlike women, men were not expected to have small, delicate features but rather should have features that were bold and masculine, while still being well-proportioned and attractive. The forehead should be broad and high, suggesting intelligence and noble breeding, similar to the female ideal. However, men did not pluck their hairlines as women did, as this would be considered effeminate and inappropriate. The natural hairline was accepted, though balding was generally seen as unattractive and as a sign of aging or poor health. The eyebrows should be well-defined but not thin like women's eyebrows. They should be full and dark, framing the eyes without being so heavy or unkempt as to appear wild or uncivilized. The space between the eyebrows should be smooth, without the unibrow that might suggest primitive or uncultured origins. The eyes should be clear and bright, suggesting health, intelligence, and good character. The ideal eye color for men was less rigidly defined than for women, and dark eyes could be as attractive as light eyes. What mattered more was the expression, which should be steady and confident without being threatening or aggressive. The eyes should show the internal qualities of courage, honor, and nobility that were valued in medieval men. The nose should be straight and well proportioned, neither too large nor too small. A Roman or Aquiline nose was considered attractive and aristocratic, suggesting noble ancestry. A flat or broad nose might suggest common origins, while a very large or prominent nose would be seen as a flaw, though less so than in women, where any irregularity was considered more problematic. The mouth should be well formed with a firm, decisive appearance. The lips should not be as small and rosebud-like as women's lips, but should be fuller and more masculine. The mouth should suggest capability for speech and for eating heartily, unlike the small, delicate mouths preferred in women that suggested restraint and minimal physical needs. The teeth should be white and strong, capable of tearing meat and chewing tough food. Dental problems were common in both sexes, but for men the teeth were somewhat more important as they were more frequently visible. A man would speak more freely and eat more openly than a woman, making his teeth more publicly apparent. The complexion for men was quite different from the female ideal. While very dark, deeply tanned skin that suggested constant outdoor labor might be seen as lowering one's status, men were not expected to have the pale white skin that was essential for female beauty. Instead, a man's complexion should suggest health and vigor. A ruddy, healthy color was attractive, particularly in young men. The skin should be clear but need not be as perfectly smooth and unblemished as women's skin. Some marks from sun, weather, or even from honorable combat scars could be acceptable or even attractive in men. The hair should be thick and healthy, and the ideal color was less important than the overall appearance of vitality. Hair could be dark, light, or reddish and still be attractive, as long as it was well maintained and clean. The hairstyle would depend on the fashion of the time and the man's social status, but generally, the hair should be of moderate length, not so long as to appear feminine, but not so short as to suggest he was a criminal or a slave. As such, men sometimes had their heads shaved as punishment, or as a mark of their status. Facial hair was a complex issue in medieval male beauty standards, and practices varied considerably over the period and by region. In some times and places, being clean-shaven was the fashion, while in others, beards were valued. When beards were in fashion, they should be well-groomed and not wild or unkempt. The beard should be a sign of dignity and maturity, not of neglect. A man's facial hair practices would also be influenced by his occupation and social status, as clergy were often required to be clean-shaven, while knights and nobles might wear beards. The body type considered attractive for men was quite different from female ideals. Where women should be slender and delicate, men should be strong and well-built. The ideal male body would be tall and broad-shouldered, suggesting physical strength and capability. The chest should be broad and the arms should be muscular, capable of wielding weapons and performing the physical activities expected of men. However, the ideal was not extreme muscularity, but rather a balanced, capable physique that suggested strength without brutishness. A man who was too heavily muscled might appear crude or might suggest that he was a common laborer, rather than a noble knight who had the proper balance of physical prowess and refined manners. The body should suggest controlled power rather than raw physical force. The waist and hips should be trim, and any tendency toward fat would be seen as a flaw, suggesting either gluttony or lack of physical activity, both of which were criticized in men of the noble classes. A man should be fit and active, maintaining his body through hunting, warfare practice, and other physical pursuits. The legs should be long and well-shaped, capable of riding horses and walking long distances. In the later medieval period, when fashions included fitted hose that displayed the shape of the legs, well-formed calves, and thighs became more important as visible markers of male attractiveness. The legs should be straight and strong, without being overly thick or crudely muscular. The overall bearing and deportment were extremely important in male beauty standards, perhaps even more important than specific physical features. A man should carry himself with confidence and authority, should have a noble bearing that suggested his high birth, and should move with the grace and control of a trained warrior. The way a man walked, sat, stood, and gestured were all part of his attractiveness, and a man with perfect features who moved awkwardly or without dignity would not be considered truly handsome. For knights and nobles, skill in martial activities was a significant component of attractiveness. A man who could fight well, who could joust successfully, who could ride horses expertly, who could hunt with skill, would be considered more attractive than a man who lacked these abilities, regardless of his physical appearance. Physical prowess and the honors won in tournament or battle were powerful markers of male beauty and desirability. For clergy, intellectual accomplishments and spiritual authority replaced martial prowess as markers of attractiveness. A clergyman would be judged on his learning, his piety, his skill in theology and debate, and his ability to project spiritual authority. Physical appearance still mattered, but it was secondary to these intellectual and spiritual qualities. The age at which a man was considered most attractive was different from women as well. Women were valued for youth and were considered most beautiful in their teens and early 20s, with attractiveness declining as they aged. Men, however, could be attractive across a broader age range. A young man in his prime, perhaps in his 20s or 30s, would be attractive for his physical vitality and potential. But older men could also be attractive if they had achieved status, wealth, and respect, and if they maintained their health and bearing. A distinguished older man with gray hair could be quite attractive, while an older woman with gray hair would be seen as past her prime. These differences in male and female beauty standards reflected the different social roles and values associated with each gender. Women were valued primarily for their appearance, their fertility, and their ability to bring honor to their families through advantageous marriages. Their beauty was crucial to their social value and had a relatively short peak period. Men were valued for their abilities, accomplishments, and status, with physical appearance being one factor among many. Their attractiveness could be maintained or even enhanced as they gained power and prestige over time. Understanding male beauty standards alongside female standards helps us see the complete picture of medieval aesthetics and helps us understand how deeply beauty ideals were connected to social structures and gender hierarchies. Beauty was never merely about appearance, but was always about power, status, and social role. Chapter 4. Beauty, Practices and Cosmetics. Having established what physical features were considered beautiful in medieval times, let us now examine in exhaustive detail the practices and products that medieval people used to achieve or enhance beauty. These practices ranged from simple grooming to elaborate cosmetic preparations, and understanding them reveals much about medieval life and values. Hair care was an important but laborious process in medieval times. Hair washing required heating large amounts of water, which was time-consuming and required substantial fuel. As a result, hair was not washed frequently by modern standards, perhaps once every few weeks or even less often. When hair was washed, various substances might be used to clean it and to enhance its appearance. Plain water would be the base for hair washing, but various additives would be mixed in to improve the cleaning and to scent the hair. Lye, which is an alkaline solution made from wood ashes, was sometimes used as it would cut through oils and dirt. However, lye was harsh and could damage hair with overuse. Soap, when available, might be used, though soap was expensive and might not be used for hair washing even by relatively prosperous people. Various herbal infusions would be added to the washing water. Rosemary, lavender, chamomile, and other herbs would be steeped in hot water to create fragrant rinses that would clean the hair and leave it smelling pleasant. Different herbs were believed to have different properties, with some thought to strengthen hair, some to add shine, and some to improve color. For blonde hair, which was the preferred color, special treatments would be used to lighten the hair or to add golden highlights. Lemon juice, if available, might be applied to the hair before exposure to sun, as the acid and sun together would gradually lighten hair. Other substances, including chamomile infusions, honey, and various plant extracts, would be used for their supposed lightening properties. Women who wanted to darken their hair might use preparations made from walnut shells, which would leave a dark stain on hair. However, darkening hair was less common than lightening it, as light hair was more valued. Red hair, which as mentioned was viewed with some suspicion, was sometimes subject to attempts at changing the color through various dyes and rinses. After washing, hair would be dried by sitting near a fire or in the sun if weather permitted. The drying process would take considerable time, as medieval women typically had very long hair that had never been cut. Once dry, the hair would be combed using combs made of wood, bone, or ivory. Fine-toothed combs were used to remove tangles and to remove lice and nits, which were a constant problem in medieval times due to poor hygiene and close living conditions. Hair would then be styled according to fashion and according to the woman's marital status. Young unmarried women might wear their hair loose and flowing, perhaps with a simple circlet or wreath of flowers to hold it in place. Married women would typically cover their hair with veils, wimples, or various forms of headdress that concealed the hair, partially or completely. The specific style of head covering varied by region, time period, and social class. Creating or maintaining pale skin, which was essential for female beauty, required constant effort and various treatments. The most basic approach was simply to avoid sun exposure as much as possible. Noble women would stay indoors during the brightest parts of the day, would wear wide-brimmed hats or veils when they did go outside, and would use fans or parasols to shield their faces from sun. The elaborate headdresses and veils worn by medieval women served partly to protect the complexion from sun and weather. For removing freckles or dark spots, various preparations would be applied to the skin. These might include mixtures made from cucumber, lemon, or other plant extracts that were thought to have lightening properties. More problematic were preparations containing white lead or mercury, which would indeed whiten the skin but would also cause serious poisoning with prolonged use. These toxic cosmetics would be absorbed through the skin and would accumulate in the body, causing various health problems including neurological damage. To achieve the desired rosy blush on the cheeks, women would use various rouge preparations. These might be made from crushed red berries, from beet juice, from red ochre, or from other natural colorants. The rouge would be applied to the cheeks in small amounts to create a natural-looking flush. However, the use of cosmetics was somewhat controversial, as excessive makeup was seen as immodest and was criticized by moralists and by the church. For the lips, similar red preparations would be used to create the desired rosy color. The lips should not be too vividly colored, but should have a natural-looking healthy redness. The application should be subtle and should not be obvious to observers, as obvious makeup was considered vulgar. For the eyes, various preparations might be used to make them appear larger and brighter. Eyebrow plucking, as mentioned earlier, was extensively practiced to create the desired thin, arched eyebrows and the high, clear forehead. This plucking would be done with small tweezers and would be painful and time-consuming but was considered essential for fashionable appearance. Some women would darken their eyelashes using preparations made from soot or charcoal mixed with various substances to create a paste that would adhere to the lashes. However, eye makeup was not as elaborate as in some other historical periods, and the emphasis was more on the natural shape and color of the eyes than on dramatically enhancing them with cosmetics. Teeth care was rudimentary by modern standards, but was still practiced to the extent possible. Teeth might be cleaned by rubbing them with a cloth or with a twig from certain plants that could be frayed to create a primitive toothbrush. Various powders and pastes might be used to clean teeth and to whiten them, made from substances including crushed chalk, salt, herbs, and various other ingredients. However, dental health was generally poor due to diet and lack of effective preventive care. Breath freshening was attempted through chewing various herbs including mint, parsley, or fennel. Cloves and other spices might be chewed if available. Though these were expensive, bad breath was a common problem due to poor dental health, and to the medieval diet and various solutions would be tried to mask the smell. Body care involved washing, when possible, though full baths were not frequent. A basin of water and a cloth might be used for washing the face, hands, and exposed parts of the body on a daily basis, while full body washing would be done less frequently. Public bathhouses existed in many medieval towns and provided opportunities for bathing, steaming, and sometimes massage, but the frequency of visits varied based on cost and availability. Various scents and perfumes would be used to make the body smell pleasant, as body odor was a constant issue due to infrequent washing and the lack of effective deodorants. Perfumes might be made from flower essences, from herbs, from spices, or from various other fragrant substances. These would be applied to the body or to clothing. However, perfumes were expensive and were primarily used by the wealthy. Clothing was an essential part of beauty practices, as the right clothing would enhance one's appearance and would demonstrate proper social status. Clean, well-maintained clothing was important, though laundering was laborious and was not done as frequently as modern standards would dictate. Clothing would be brushed, aired, and spot cleaned between washings. For women, the fit and style of clothing would be chosen to emphasize the desired silhouette and to display the appropriate amount of skin according to fashion and modesty standards. The neckline would show the throat and perhaps the upper chest, displaying the pale skin that was so valued. The sleeves would often be tight on the arms, displaying their slenderness. The skirt would be long and would conceal the legs and feet. Jewelry and accessories were important for those who could afford them. Women would wear necklaces, brooches, rings, and other ornaments that would add to their beauty and would demonstrate their wealth and status. The jewelry would be made from gold or silver and might be set with precious stones. However, sumptuary laws restricted what jewelry could be worn by different social classes, and common women would have at most simple ornaments, if any. All of these beauty practices were time-consuming and were often uncomfortable or even dangerous. The effort required to maintain medieval beauty standards would be exhausting, and the results would still fall short of the ideals portrayed in art and literature. The toxic cosmetics, the painful hair removal, the constant vigilance against sun exposure, the elaborate hairstyling, all of these would make the pursuit of beauty a significant burden, particularly for noble women who were expected to maintain the highest standards of appearance. Chapter 5. Clothing and Fashion. Clothing in medieval times was not merely a matter of covering the body, but was an essential component of beauty and a crucial marker of social identity. Let us examine in detail how clothing functioned in the medieval beauty system and how fashion evolved over the medieval period. The basic garment for women was the dress or gown, which would extend from the neck to the floor. The construction and style of this dress varied considerably over the medieval period and between regions, but certain features were relatively consistent. The dress would typically be made in layers, with an undergarment called a chemise worn next to the skin, one or more layers of dress over that, and possibly an outer layer or overdress for formal occasions. The chemise was made of linen and served multiple purposes, including absorbing sweat, protecting the outer garments from body oils and dirt, and providing a layer of modesty. The chemise would be washed more frequently than the outer garments, though still not as often as modern undergarments. The chemise would typically be white or off-white and would be relatively simple in construction, with long sleeves and a neckline that was covered by the outer dress. The dress itself would be made from wool, linen, or silk, depending on the wearer's social status and wealth. Wool was the most common fabric for ordinary people, as it was produced locally throughout Europe and was relatively affordable. Linen was also common and was often used for summer garments, as it was cooler than wool. Silk was expensive and was imported from the East, making it a buying luxury available only to the wealthy. The choice of fabric was not just about comfort or aesthetics, but was a clear marker of social class. The color of the dress was also significant. Bright, vivid colors required expensive dyes and were therefore associated with wealth and status. Blues made from indigo or woad, reds made from madder or kermes insects, purples made from lichens or mollusks, and other colors would vary in their expense and prestige. Common people would typically wear clothing in natural, undyed colors or in colors achieved with cheap, local dyes that would produce browns, yellows, or dull greens. The fit and style of the dress would change over the medieval period, following the fashions of each era. In the early medieval period, dresses were relatively loose and simple, with straight silhouettes that revealed little about the body beneath. As the period progressed, dresses became more fitted, with techniques like lacing and tailoring used to create garments that conformed to the body and displayed the figure more clearly. The neckline of the dress was important for displaying the throat and chest, which were considered attractive and were meant to be visible. However, the neckline could not be too low or too revealing, as this would be considered immodest and inappropriate. The exact height and shape of the neckline varied with fashion, but always involved a balance between display and modesty. The sleeves of the dress were subject to elaborate fashion variations. They might be tight and close-fitting, emphasizing the slenderness of the bombs. They might be wide and flowing, creating a graceful effect when the arms moved. They might be long, extending over the hands, or might end at the wrist. The sleeves might be decorated with embroidery or trim, adding visual interest and demonstrating the wearer's wealth and taste. The waist of the dress would typically be defined by a belt or girdle, which would not only serve a practical function of holding the garment in place but would also be a decorative element and a place to attach purses, keys, or other items a woman might need to carry. The belt might be made of leather, fabric, or metal, depending on the wearer's status and the formality of the occasion. The skirt of the dress would be full and long, extending to bore the ground and often trailing behind in a train for formal wear. The length and fullness of the skirt and the presence or absence of a train would indicate the wearer's status. A woman who needed to work could not manage a very long, full skirt, so such garments were markers of leisure class status. Common women would wear shorter skirts that allowed them to move more easily and would not drag in the dirt. Over the point dress, women might wear an overdress or surcoat, which was a sleeveless or short-sleeved garment that would be worn for warmth, for modesty, or for fashion. The overdress might be made of richer fabric than the worn underdress and might be more elaborately decorated. In some periods, the sides of the overdress would be open, creating a decorative effect and allowing the underdress to be seen. Head coverings were essential for married women and were often worn by unmarried women as well, though the styles differed. The most basic head covering was a veil, which was a piece of fabric that would cover the hair and would be draped in various ways. More structured head covering included wimples, which covered the neck and sides of the face, and various forms of headdresses that became increasingly elaborate over the medieval period. By the late medieval period, headdresses had become extremely complex and fashionable, with styles including the hennin, which was a tall, cone-shaped headdress from which a veil would flow, and various other elaborate constructions. These headdresses were expensive to make, uncomfortable to wear, and served primarily as status symbols and fashion statements. They were criticized by moralists as examples of vanity and excessive concern with appearance. Men's clothing followed similar principles of using fabric, color, and style to indicate social status while conforming to the appropriate gender presentation. Men wore tunics or doublets as their main upper garment, with hose or breeches covering the legs. The length, thought, fit, and decoration of these garments would indicate the wearer's social position. For noble men, the tunic might be made of fine wool or silk and might be elaborately decorated with embroidery or trim. The colors would be rich and the fit would be precise, showing off the man's physique. For common men, the tunic would be simpler, made of coarser fabric, and would be less fitted and less decorated. Men's hose became increasingly important in the later medieval period, as they were made of fabric that stretched to conform to the leg, displaying its shape. Well-turned calves and thighs were considered attractive, and the fitted hose would show these to advantage. The hose might be of different colors on each leg, following the fashion of parti-colored or my-party clothing. Footwear for both men and women was an important aspect of fashion and social distinction. Shoes and boots would be made of leather and would vary in their quality and decoration according to the wearer's status. In some periods, the toes of shoes would be extended into long points, with the length of the points being regulated by sumptuary laws, as excessively long points were reserved for the nobility. The overall effect of medieval fashion was to create visual markers of identity that could be read at a glance. A person's clothing would immediately communicate their social class, their marital status, their occupation in some cases, and their conformity to social norms and fashion expectations. Beauty and fashion were inseparable, as beauty required not just having the right physical features but also presenting oneself according to the appropriate fashion standards for one's social position. The effort and expense required to maintain fashionable appearance were considerable, particularly for noble women who were expected to maintain the highest standards. New garments would need to be commissioned from professional tailors and seamstresses, requiring multiple fittings and careful attention to detail. Fabrics would need to be purchased, often at great expense. Garments would need to be maintained, with repairs made as needed and cleaning done to prevent excessive wear. For common people, clothing represented a significant investment and would be worn for years, passed down to family members, or sold second-hand when outgrown. The clothing would be mended repeatedly to extend its life, and every effort would be made to avoid damage. The contrast between the elaborate, fashionable clothing of the wealthy and the simple, practical clothing of common people would be visible and would constantly reinforce the social hierarchy. Understanding clothing and fashion helps us see that medieval beauty standards were not just about natural physical features, but about the complete presentation of self through grooming, cosmetics, and dress. Beauty was constructed through effort, expense, and conformity to social expectations, and it served as a visual language that communicated status, role, and identity in medieval society. Chapter 6. Regional and temporal variations. While we have been discussing medieval beauty standards as though they were uniform, the reality was more complex. Standards varied significantly between different regions of Europe and changed over the long span of the medieval period. Let us examine these variations in detail to develop a more nuanced understanding of medieval beauty ideals. In Mediterranean regions, including Italy, southern France, and Spain, beauty standards were influenced by the warmer climate, by connections with Byzantine and Islamic cultures, and by the survival of more classical Roman influences. The ideal complexion, while still pale, might be less aggressively white than in northern Europe, as the intense sun made extreme paleness harder to maintain. A warm, creamy complexion might be more attainable and thus more valued than a stark white one. Mediterranean fashion tended toward lighter fabrics and somewhat different silhouettes than northern fashion, reflecting the climate. The elaborate layering and heavy fabrics of northern Europe would be impractical. In Mediterranean heat, colors might be brighter and more saturated, taking advantage of excellent dyeing traditions and trade connections that provided access to expensive dyes. In Italy, particularly in wealthy city-states like Venice and Florence, fashion and beauty standards were influenced by trade connections with the East and by the Renaissance values that began to emerge in the late medieval period. There was perhaps more emphasis on beauty as an art form and more acceptance of cosmetics and elaborate dress as legitimate forms of self-expression rather than as vanity. In northern Europe, including England, Scotland, Scandinavia, and northern Germany, the colder climate and the cultural traditions produced somewhat different standards. The emphasis on pale skin was perhaps even stronger than in the south, as pale skin was more achievable in a region with less intense sun. The ideal of blonde hair was also more prevalent, as blonde hair was more common in northern populations and thus was seen as a marker of true northern European ancestry. Northern fashion tended toward heavier fabrics, more layering for warmth, and somewhat different silhouettes. The colors might be somewhat darker and less saturated than in the south, partly because of the availability of different dye stuffs and partly because of cultural preferences. Northern decoration might emphasize furs and jewelry rather than the elaborate embroidery and bright colors of the south. In France, which was culturally dominant in many respects, during much of the medieval period, fashion and beauty standards were trend-setting and were often imitated in other regions. French ideals of courtly love and chivalric culture influenced how beauty was conceptualized and valued. The French court was a center of fashion, and styles developed there would spread to other courts and to the nobility throughout Europe. The temporal variations in beauty standards over the nearly 1,000-year span of the medieval period were perhaps even more significant than the regional variations. The early medieval period, roughly from 500 to 1000 CE, had relatively simple beauty standards that were influenced by the disruption of Roman civilization, and by the Church's emphasis on spiritual rather than physical beauty. During this early period, fashion was relatively static, and regional variations were pronounced, as there was less communication and trade between regions. Beauty ideals were less elaborately defined than they would become later, and the emphasis was on practical appearance that demonstrated appropriate social role rather than on achieving elaborate aesthetic effects. The high medieval period, roughly from 100 to 1300 CE, saw increasing prosperity, greater trade, more complex social structures, and the development of more elaborate beauty standards. This was the period of courtly love literature, of increasing emphasis on fashion and appearance, and of the development of many of the specific beauty ideals we have discussed. During the high medieval period, the ideal of the pale-skinned, blonde, slender lady with delicate features became firmly established. The practice of hairline plucking became common, cosmetics became more widely used. Despite religious criticism, fashion became more varied and more rapidly changing, with new styles emerging and spreading through noble circles. The late medieval period, roughly from 1300 to 1500 CE, saw the most elaborate development of fashion and beauty standards. Here dresses became bought increasingly complex and varied. Clothing became bought more fitted and more tailored, with techniques developed to create garments that conformed precisely to the body. Cosmetics became more sophisticated, though also potentially more dangerous, with the use of toxic substances like white lead and mercury. The late medieval period also saw increasing regulation of appearance through sumptuary laws as authorities tried to maintain visible distinctions between social classes in a time of increasing social mobility and urban wealth. Merchants and wealthy townspeople were adopting fashions that had previously been reserved for nobility, and this threatened visual markers of social hierarchy. The sumptuary laws were attempts to preserve these markers by legally restricting what different classes could wear. During the late medieval period, there was also increasing criticism of elaborate fashion and beauty practices from religious reformers and moralists who saw them as symptoms of spiritual decline and excessive worldliness. The tension between the desire to be fashionable and beautiful and the religious teachings that warned against vanity and pride would be an ongoing source of anxiety, particularly for devout individuals. The Black Death, which devastated Europe in the mid-14th century, had complex effects on beauty standards and fashion. The massive death toll and social disruption disrupted fashion production and consumption temporarily. However, in the aftermath, as survivors inherited wealth and as labor shortages gave workers more bargaining power, there was actually an increase in fashion consciousness and in the elaboration of dress among those who could afford it. The end of the medieval period saw the beginning of the Renaissance, which would bring new values and new aesthetic ideals. The Renaissance emphasis on individual achievement, on classical learning, and on human potential would gradually shift beauty standards towards somewhat different ideals, though many medieval influences would persist well into the early modern period. Understanding these regional and temporal variations helps us see that medieval beauty standards were not static or monolithic, but were constantly evolving and adapting to changing circumstances. What was beautiful in 10th century Northern Europe was somewhat different from what was beautiful in 15th century Italy. However, certain themes remained relatively constant, including the association of beauty with moral worth, the importance of social class in determining appropriate appearance, and the greater scrutiny and constraint applied to female beauty compared to male appearance. Chapter 7. The Consequences of Beauty Standards. Having examined medieval beauty standards in detail, let us now consider the consequences of these standards for the people who lived under them. Beauty standards are never merely aesthetic preferences, but have real effects on people's lives, opportunities, and well-being, and medieval beauty standards were no exception. For women, beauty was directly connected to marriage prospects and thus to their entire life trajectory. A beautiful woman from a good family could expect to make an advantageous marriage, securing a husband of high status and resources. This would give her a comfortable life, would position her children well, and would bring honor to her family. Beauty was thus a valuable asset that could be leveraged into social and economic security. Conversely, a woman who was not beautiful by medieval standards faced significant disadvantages. She might need to accept a less advantageous marriage, marrying a man of lower status or fewer resources than her more beautiful sisters or peers. If she was notably unattractive, she might struggle to find any husband at all, which would be a serious problem in a society that expected all women to marry and that provided few respectable alternatives for unmarried women. The pressure to be beautiful would create anxiety and stress for women and girls. From a young age, girls would be aware that their appearance would determine much of their future, and they would be constantly evaluated and compared to others. Mothers would scrutinize their daughters' appearance and would use various methods to enhance beauty or to correct perceived flaws. Girls with features that did not conform to ideals would be made aware of their shortcomings and would carry this knowledge as a burden. The beauty practices themselves could be harmful. We have mentioned the toxic cosmetics, including lead and mercury compounds, that would poison those who use them regularly. The hair removal practices, including extensive plucking of hairlines and eyebrows, would be painful and would sometimes cause infections or scarring. The tight lacing and restrictive clothing could cause breathing difficulties and could deform the ribcage over time. The efforts to maintain pale skin by avoiding sun and fresh air could contribute to vitamin D deficiency and general poor health. the time and money required to maintain beauty standards would be significant. For noble women, the expectation was to maintain the highest standards of appearance, which required employing servants to help with hair care, clothing, maintenance, and other aspects of grooming. The cost of cosmetics, fabrics, jewelry, and other beauty-related items would be substantial. The time spent on grooming and dressing could take hours each day, time that could not be spent on other activities. For common women, the inability to afford the products and practices used by noble women would be a constant reminder of their lower status. They would know what beauty required, but would not have the resources to achieve it. This would reinforce their sense of being inferior and would limit their aspirations. The visible differences in appearance between classes would maintain the social hierarchy by making it obvious who belonged to which class. The emphasis on female beauty and the detailed scrutiny of women's appearance would objectify women and would reduce them to their physical attributes. A woman's character, intelligence, abilities, and accomplishments would be secondary to her appearance in determining her value and her opportunities. This objectification would be internalized by women who would learn to see themselves primarily as objects to be looked at and judged rather than as full human beings with agency and worth beyond their appearance. For men, the consequences of beauty standards were somewhat different but were still significant. A handsome man would have advantages in making a good marriage, in gaining the favor of superiors, and being generally well regarded. However, male beauty was less crucial than female beauty, as men had other ways to demonstrate value, including military prowess, wealth, political connections, and abilities in various fields. Men who were not handsome could compensate through accomplishments and could still be successful and respected. However, notable physical flaws or deformities could still create difficulties. A man with a severe disfigurement might be seen as cursed or as having some moral failing that was reflected in his appearance. He might face discrimination and limited opportunities, though less so than a woman with similar disfigurements. The beauty standards for both men and women reinforced social hierarchies and maintained class distinctions. The fact that noble standards of beauty required resources that common people could not afford meant that nobles would look different from commoners, and these visible differences would reinforce the idea that nobles were inherently superior. The sumptuary laws that restricted what different classes could wear were explicit attempts to maintain these visible markers of hierarchy. The religious criticism of excessive concern with beauty created a tension that particularly affected women. Women were told that beauty was good and was a blessing from God, but they were also told that excessive attention to beauty was sinful vanity. They were expected to be beautiful, to attract good husbands, and to honor their families, but they were criticized if they seemed too concerned with their appearance. This created a no-win situation where women could not avoid being judged on their appearance, but were also condemned for caring about it. The elderly faced particular challenges related to beauty standards. As people aged and lost the features associated with youth and beauty, they would be seen as less valuable and less attractive. For women especially, aging would mean a loss of social value and attention. Older women would be largely invisible in a society that valued female beauty so highly. The fear of aging and the loss of beauty would be a source of anxiety for women throughout their lives. The connection between beauty and moral worth meant that people who did not conform to beauty standards might be seen as morally suspect. Ugly people might be thought to have inner ugliness of soul that was reflected in their appearance. This was particularly problematic for people with disabilities or disfigurements, who might be seen as cursed or as having offended God in some way. The social stigma attached to not being beautiful could be severe and could affect every aspect of a person's life. Understanding the consequences of medieval beauty standards helps us see that these were not trivial matters of fashion or personal preference, but were systems of social control that affected people's life, chances, and opportunities. Beauty standards enforced gender roles, maintained class hierarchies, and created suffering for those who could not or would not conform. While modern beauty standards also have problematic aspects, understanding the medieval context helps us appreciate both how much has changed and how some of the underlying dynamics persist. Chapter 8. Conclusion and Final Reflections. As we conclude this exhaustive examination of what beauty standards were like in medieval times, let us reflect on what we have learned and consider the vast differences between medieval and modern conceptions of beauty. This lengthy exploration should have thoroughly explored every tedious detail of medieval beauty ideals and should have helped you drift peacefully towards sleep. Medieval beauty standards were complex, class-based, gender-differentiated, and deeply embedded in the social, religious, and cultural systems of the time. They were not arbitrary aesthetic preferences, but were meaningful parts of how medieval society organized itself and how individuals understood their place in that society. Beauty was never just about appearance, but was always about status, morality, and social role. The specific physical features valued in medieval beauty were quite different from many modern ideals. The extremely pale skin, the high plucked forehead, the tiny rosebud mouth, the slender and delicate body, all of these medieval female ideals would look strange to modern eyes. The emphasis on indicators of social class rather than on health or vitality would strike modern people as perverse. The toxic cosmetics and painful beauty practices would be horrifying by modern standards of self-care. Yet medieval people pursued these ideals with dedication and at considerable cost because beauty mattered intensely in their world. For women especially, beauty could determine whether life would be comfortable or difficult, whether marriage would be to a desirable or undesirable partner, whether children would have good prospects or poor ones. The stakes were high enough to justify the effort, expense, and suffering involved in pursuing beauty. The gendered nature of medieval beauty standards, with women subject to much more intense scrutiny and constraint than men, reflected and reinforced the patriarchal structure of medieval society. Women's value was largely determined by their appearance and by their reproductive capacity, while men had multiple ways to demonstrate worth. This inequality was built into the beauty system and was perpetuated through it. The connection between beauty and social class was also fundamental. Beauty standards required resources to achieve, and this meant that nobles could look beautiful, while commoners could not. The visible differences in appearance helped maintain the class hierarchy by making it obvious who belonged where. The sumptuary laws that regulated dress by class were explicit acknowledgments that appearance was a political matter, not just a personal one. The religious dimensions of medieval beauty standards created contradictions and tensions. The church taught that physical beauty was less important than spiritual beauty, yet society clearly valued physical appearance highly. Women were caught between the expectation that they be beautiful and the criticism that concern with beauty was sinful vanity. This created a psychological burden that was difficult to navigate. The regional and temporal variations in medieval beauty standards remind us that what counts as beautiful is culturally and historically specific. The ideals of 10th century England were different from those of 15th century Italy, yet both were meaningfully medieval. Beauty standards are not universal or natural, but are socially constructed and changeable. The consequences of medieval beauty standards for individuals, particularly for women, were significant and often harmful. The pressure to conform, the anxiety about appearance, the time and money spent on beauty practices, the physical harm from toxic cosmetics and painful procedures, the social penalties for poverty, not being beautiful, all of these created suffering that was accepted as normal and necessary. Comparing medieval beauty standards to modern ones reveals both changes and continuities. Modern beauty standards are less rigid in some ways, with more acceptance of diversity and with less strict connection between beauty and social class. Modern cosmetics are less toxic and more effective. Modern beauty practices are less painful and less time-consuming in some respects. However, modern beauty standards still create pressure and anxiety, still affect life opportunities, still objectify women more than men, and still require significant time and money to pursue. The fundamental dynamic where appearance is judged against socially constructed ideals and where failure to conform creates disadvantage has persisted even as the specific ideals have changed. Understanding medieval beauty standards gives us perspective on our own. We can see that the features and practices we consider beautiful today are not natural or inevitable, but are products of our particular culture and time, just as medieval standards were products of theirs. This understanding might help us be more critical of current beauty pressures and more compassionate toward those who do not conform to current standards. Chapter 9: Beauty in Medieval Art and Beauty and Literature. To fully understand medieval beauty standards, we must examine how beauty was portrayed and described in the art and literature of the period. These artistic representations both reflected and shaped beauty ideals, creating models that people would attempt to emulate and standards against which real people would be judged. In medieval painting and illuminated manuscripts, beautiful women were depicted according to very specific conventions. The Virgin Mary, who was the ultimate ideal of female beauty and virtue, was almost always shown with pale, white skin, delicate features, a small mouth, and a serene, modest expression. Her body would be slender and graceful, with no emphasis on physical sexuality. She would typically wear blue robes, as blue was associated with purity and with the heavens, and her head would be covered as befitted a married woman. Saints and noble ladies in religious art would follow similar conventions. Their faces would be oval with high foreheads. Their skin would be uniformly pale without any shadows or variations in tone that might suggest three-dimensionality, and their bodies would be elongated and slender. The paintings were not attempting to create realistic portraits, but were presenting idealized types that communicated moral and social messages. In secular art, beautiful women were depicted in similar ways, but with somewhat more variety and with details that suggested worldly status rather than spiritual purity. A noble lady in a secular painting might wear rich clothing with elaborate patterns, might display jewelry, and might have her hair styled in the latest fashion rather than being covered. However, her facial features and body type would still follow the established conventions of pale skin, high forehead, small delicate features, and slender build. The technique of medieval painting emphasized line and flat areas of color rather than realistic modeling of form, which reinforced the idealized nature of beauty depictions. Beautiful women were almost abstract symbols rather than real individuals, and this abstraction allowed them to embody ideal qualities without the complications and imperfections of actual human appearance. In medieval literature, descriptions of beautiful women followed formulaic patterns that were repeated with minor variations across many different works. A beautiful woman would be described starting from the top of her head and working downward, with each feature praised in conventional language. Her hair would be compared to gold threads or to sunlight. Her forehead would be compared to ivory or to marble. Her eyebrows would be like fine lines drawn by an artist. Her eyes would be like stars or gems. Her nose would be straight and well proportioned. Her mouth would be like a rosebud or like cherries. Her teeth would be like pearls. Her neck would be like a swan's neck or a tower. Her skin would be like snow or cream or milk. These descriptions were so formulaic that they could almost be assembled from stock phrases, and indeed many medieval writers did seem to be working from a standard template. The repetition of these descriptions across different works reinforced the beauty standards by making them seem natural and inevitable. If every beautiful woman in every story had blonde hair and pale skin, then blonde hair and pale skin must be the essential components of beauty. The literature of courtly love, which flourished particularly in the 12th and 13th centuries, created an elaborate culture around the worship of female beauty. In courtly love literature, a knight would fall in love with a lady, typically a married noblewoman, and would dedicate himself to her service. He would worship her beauty from afar, would perform great deeds in her honor, and would suffer nobly from the pain of his unrequited love. The lady would be described as the most beautiful woman in the world, the paragon of all feminine virtues, almost a goddess rather than a human being. This courtly love tradition elevated female beauty to an almost religious status, making the beautiful woman an object of devotion. However, this apparent celebration of women was actually quite problematic, as it reduced women to passive objects of male fantasy. The lady in courtly love poetry had no inner life, no real personality, no agency. She existed only to be beautiful and to be worshipped. Real women would be judged against this impossible ideal and would inevitably fall short. Medieval romance literature featured beautiful heroines whose beauty was essential to the plot. The heroine's beauty would cause the hero to fall in love with her, would create conflicts as other men also desired her, and would be rewarded in the end when she married the hero and lived happily ever after. The message was clear: beauty leads to good outcomes, including love, marriage, and happiness. Conversely, ugly women in medieval literature were often portrayed as evil, as in the case of witches and wicked stepmothers. Religious literature presented more complex views of beauty. Saints' lives would often mention that a point female saint was beautiful, using this as evidence of God's favor. However, the saint would typically renounce concern with her beauty and would sometimes deliberately mar her appearance to discourage suitors and to demonstrate her rejection of worldly vanity. The ideal was to have beauty but not to value it or to use it for worldly purposes. Didactic literature that offered advice on proper behavior would warn against excessive concern with beauty, while simultaneously providing detailed instructions on how to maintain appropriate appearance. This contradictory messaging reflected the tension between religious teachings that condemned vanity and social realities that made beauty essential for success. Medical and scientific text of the medieval period discussed beauty in terms of humoral theory and physiological function. Beauty was seen as a sign of health and proper humoral balance, while ugliness suggested disease or imbalance. The pale, cool complexion of the beautiful woman reflected dominance of the phlegmatic humor, which was associated with femininity. The ruddy, warm complexion of the beautiful man reflected dominance of the phlegmatic humor, which was associated with femininity. The ruddy, warm complexion of the beautiful man reflected proper balance of the sanguine humor, which was associated with masculinity. These medical theories provided a pseudo-scientific justification for beauty standards, making them seem natural rather than culturally constructed. If beauty reflected health and proper bodily function, then pursuing beauty was not mere vanity but was maintaining one's health and fulfilling one's natural potential. The cumulative effect of beauty portrayals in art and literature was to create and reinforce very specific ideals that would be internalized by medieval people. From childhood, people would be exposed to these images and descriptions and would learn what beauty looked like. They would compare themselves and others to these ideals and would judge accordingly. The power of these artistic and literary representations cannot be overstated, as they shaped how people saw themselves and others. Chapter 10. The Beauty Market and Beauty Professionals. The pursuit of beauty in medieval times created economic opportunities and gave rise to various professionals and merchants who catered to beauty needs. Let us examine this beauty economy and the people who participated in it. Cosmetics were produced and sold by various specialists, including apothecaries, who made medicines, and also beauty preparations, perfumers, who created scents, and sometimes other cosmetic items, and merchants who imported exotic ingredients. The production of cosmetics required knowledge of herbs, minerals, and other substances, and required skill in combining them into effective preparations. Recipes for cosmetics would be written down and shared, though many would also be kept as trade secrets by those who made them professionally. A successful cosmetic preparation could be quite profitable, and makers would guard their formulas. However, recipes would also circulate among women who made their own cosmetics at home, and many such recipes survive in medieval manuscripts. A typical recipe for a face whitening preparation might include ingredients such as white lead, ground pearls, eggshells, or various plant extracts that were believed to lighten skin. The ingredients would be ground into a fine powder and then mixed with a liquid such as rose water, vinegar, or wine to create a paste that could be applied to face. The recipe would include instructions on how to prepare and apply the mixture, and might include warnings or advice about its use. Rouge recipes would include red colorants, such as madder root, Brazil wood, red ochre, or vermilion, mixed with fats or waxes, to create a product that would adhere to the cheeks. The application should be subtle, creating a natural-looking flush rather than obvious paint. Some recipes would include ingredients claimed to have beneficial effects beyond just color, such as rose oil for scent or various herbs for skin health. Hair care recipes were numerous and varied. Recipes for cleaning hair might include lye water, soap, various herb infusions, or eggs, which were thought to cleanse up and condition hair. Recipes for promoting bont hair growth or preventing hair loss included various plant extracts, animal fats, and sometimes quite exotic ingredients. The bont effectiveness of these preparations would be variable at best, but they were widely used. Hair lightening recipes would include ingredients such as lemon juice, honey, saffron, chamomile, and other substances thought to bring out golden highlights. Some recipes involved applying the mixture and then sitting in the sun to allow the combined effects of the chemicals and sunlight to lighten the hair. More aggressive recipes might include lye or other alkaline substances that would strip color from hair, but would also damage it. Perfume making was a specialized craft that could be quite lucrative. Perfumes were made from essential oils extracted from flowers, from aromatic herbs and spices, from animal products such as musk and ambergris, and from various other fragrant substances. The extraction of essential oils required specialized equipment and knowledge, as the process might involve distillation, pressing or soaking plant materials in oils or alcohol to extract the fragrance. A perfumer would blend various scents to create complex fragrances that would be pleasant and would last on the skin or on clothing. The most expensive perfumes would include rare ingredients imported from the East, such as frankincense, myrrh, sandalwood, and various exotic spices. These perfumes would be sold to wealthy customers who could afford such luxuries. Hairdressers and beauticians existed in some form, particularly for serving wealthy, noble households. A noble lady would have personal servants who specialized in hair care, in dressing her, and in applying cosmetics. These servants would develop expertise in the techniques and would be valued for their skills. A lady's maid who was particularly skilled at creating fashionable hairstyles or at applying cosmetics subtly and effectively would be sought after. Professional hairdressers might also operate in towns and cities, offering services to those who could afford them. These might be combined with bathhouses, where people would come for bathing and grooming services. The hairdresser would wash, cut, and style hair, would sometimes offer shaving services for men, and might also sell various beauty products. Barber surgeons, who combined the roles of barber and medical practitioner, would provide services including shaving, hair cutting, tooth pulling, bloodletting, and various minor surgical procedures. While their primary function was not beauty-related, they did help with grooming and appearance maintenance. Dressmakers and tailors were essential professionals for anyone concerned with fashion and appearance. Making clothing in medieval times was extremely labor-intensive, requiring spinning thread, weaving fabric, and then cutting and sewing the garments. Professional makers would have the skills to create well-fitted, fashionable garments that would display the wearer's status appropriately. For the wealthy, having garments custom-made by skilled tailors was essential for maintaining proper appearance. The tailor would measure the client, would discuss the style and fabric choices, would create the pattern, and would construct the garment through multiple fittings to ensure proper fit. This process would take considerable time and would be expensive, but the results would be far superior to ready-made garments. Merchants who sold fabrics, trims, buttons, and other materials for making clothing would cater to both professional makers and to women who made clothing at home. The selection of appropriate fabric was important for creating the desired appearance, and wealthy customers would pay high prices for the finest silks, velvets, and other luxury fabrics. Jewelers created the ornaments that were important accessories for beauty and status display. Rings, necklaces, brooches, and other pieces would be made from precious metals and gems and would be worn by those who could afford them. The jeweler would need skills in metalworking, in setting stones, and in creating designs that were both beautiful and that communicated appropriate status messages. The beauty market also included less reputable elements. Some sellers would peddle fake or adulterated products, claiming miraculous effects that would not materialize. Beauty preparations might be contaminated or might contain harmful ingredients that were not disclosed. Customers would have little recourse if products failed to work as promised or caused harm. The existence of this beauty economy demonstrates that medieval people were willing to spend significant resources on appearance and that there were opportunities for profit in serving these needs. While we often think of medieval life as being focused on survival and as lacking the consumer culture of modern times, the beauty market shows that even in a much poorer society, people would spend money on appearance enhancement when they could afford it. Chapter 11. Beauty and the marriage market. Understanding medieval beauty standards requires examining their most important practical application. The marriage market. Marriage market was the central institution of medieval life, and beauty played a crucial role in determining marriage outcomes. Let us explore in detail how beauty functioned in the complex process of arranging marriages. For noble families, marriage was primarily a political and economic transaction. The goal was to form alliances, to consolidate or expand landholdings, to create or strengthen relationships with other powerful families, and to produce legitimate heirs. Within this calculating framework, the personal beauty of the bride and groom was theoretically secondary to considerations of lineage, property, and political advantage. However, beauty still mattered even in noble marriages. A beautiful bride was more desirable than an ugly one, all other factors being equal. The negotiations for a noble marriage would include descriptions of the physical appearance of the proposed partners and beauty would be mentioned as one of the advantages or would be glossed over quickly if it was not a strong point. A father trying to arrange an advantageous marriage for his daughter would emphasize her beauty along par with her dowry and her family connections. The beauty of a noble bride would be displayed and evaluated before the marriage was finalized. The young woman might be presented to the groom's family for their inspection, and her appearance would be scrutinized and discussed. She would be dressed in her finest clothing, her hair would be arranged beautifully, and every effort would be made to present her at her best. The prospective groom and his family would assess whether she met their standards and whether her appearance was appropriate for the alliance being formed. If the bride was found to be less beautiful than had been represented in the negotiations, this could create problems and could even lead to the marriage being called off. The family that had exaggerated the bride's beauty would face embarrassment and would damage their reputation for honesty in future marriage negotiations. Therefore, while families would present their daughters in the best light possible, they needed to be careful not to make claims that could not be supported. For merchant and craftsman families, marriage negotiations would be less elaborate than for nobility, but beauty would still be a significant factor. A merchant's daughter who was beautiful would have more and better marriage options than one who was plain or ugly. Beauty would increase the dowry that potential husbands would be willing to accept and might allow the daughter to marry above her current social station. The parents of sons looking for suitable brides would inquire about the appearance of potential daughters-in-law. Word would spread through communities about which young women were beautiful and which were not, and this gossip would influence marriage prospects. A beautiful young woman would find herself with multiple suitors, giving her family leverage in negotiations, while a plain young woman might struggle to attract any proposals. For peasants and the lower classes, marriages were still arranged by families to some degree, but there was more room for personal self-preference and for courtship that preceded the arrangement. Young people would see each other at community gatherings, at church, at festivals, and during work activities. Attraction and personal feelings might develop and might be communicated to parents, who would then negotiate the marriage if the match seemed appropriate. Even in these less formal contexts, beauty mattered. A beautiful peasant woman would have more options than an ugly one. She might be able to marry a more prosperous farmer or a skilled craftsman rather than having to settle for a poor laborer. The competition for beautiful women would be intense as the supply of beautiful women was limited while the demand was high. The age at which people married was connected to beauty standards, particularly for women. Women were considered most beautiful and most desirable in their mid to late teens and early 20s, when they combined youthful beauty with sexual maturity. Many young women were married during this period as families wanted to take advantage of their peak attractiveness to secure the best possible marriages. Women who remained unmarried into their mid-20s were at a disadvantage as they were seen as past their prime despite being quite young by modern standards. They would face decreasing marriage prospects and would likely need to accept less favorable terms than they might have received when younger. This created pressure on families to arrange marriages for their daughters before beauty faded. Men faced different timelines. Men were not valued primarily for youthful beauty, but for their ability to provide and protect. A pie man in his 30s or even 40s could still be an attractive marriage prospect if he had achieved status and resources. The age gap between husbands and wives was often substantial, with men marrying in their 20s or 30s and women marrying in their mid to late teens. The wedding itself would be a public display of beauty, particularly of the bride's beauty. The bride would be dressed in her finest clothing, would have her hair elaborately styled, and would be made as beautiful as possible. The wedding was partly a celebration, but was also a demonstration that the families had made a good match. A beautiful bride reflected well on both families and was a source of pride. After marriage, the wife's beauty would continue to be important, though in different ways. She would represent her husband's household and his status, so maintaining appropriate appearance would be her duty. She would need to dress appropriately for her station, to maintain her grooming and appearance, and to present herself in ways that brought honor rather than shame to her husband. However, the intense focus on beauty that characterized the marriage market would diminish somewhat after marriage. Once a woman was safely married and was producing children, her appearance would be less crucial than her fulfillment of her roles as wife, mother, and household manager. An older married woman who had lost her youthful beauty would not be criticized as harshly as an unmarried woman of the same age who had failed to secure a husband before her beauty faded. The connection between beauty and marriage outcomes meant that beauty had direct economic value. A beautiful woman was a more valuable commodity in the marriage market and could be exchanged for greater advantages. This commodification of female beauty was explicit in medieval culture and was not seen as problematic, but rather as natural and appropriate. Women were taught from childhood that their beauty was an asset that should be preserved and enhanced to secure the best possible marriage. Understanding the role of beauty in the marriage market helps us see why beauty standards were taken so seriously and why families would invest time and money in enhancing their daughter's beauty. It was not vanity or superficiality, but rather practical economic planning. A beautiful daughter was a valuable asset who could improve the family's position through an advantageous marriage. An ugly daughter was a burden who might require a larger dowry to compensate for her lack of beauty and who might never marry at all, remaining dependent on her family. Chapter 12, Final Comprehensive Reflections. As we bring this extremely long and thoroughly exhaustive examination of medieval beauty standards to its conclusion, let us take one last comprehensive look at what we have learned and reflect on the implications of these beauty systems for understanding both medieval culture and our own. Medieval beauty standards were intricate, detailed systems of appearance expectations that were deeply embedded in the social, economic, religious, and cultural structures of medieval society. They were not arbitrary or superficial, but were meaningful components of how medieval people organized their world and understood themselves and others. Every aspect of beauty that we have discussed at such great length served multiple functions, including signaling social status, demonstrating gender conformity, displaying moral character, facilitating marriage alliances, and reinforcing hierarchies. The specific features and practices that medieval people considered beautiful were products of their particular circumstances and values. The extreme paleness that was so valued reflected the importance of avoiding manual labor and of demonstrating noble status. The elaborate hairstyles and headdresses displayed both fashion consciousness and wealth. The modest, downcast demeanor of beautiful women reflected the gender expectations about female submissiveness. The gaunt physical strength displayed by beautiful men reflected the importance of martial abilities. The pursuit of these beauty ideals required significant effort, expense, and often involved practices that were uncomfortable, painful, or dangerous. The toxic cosmetics, the extensive hair plucking, the restrictive clothing, the elaborate grooming routines, all of these demanded much from those who sought to be beautiful. Yet people pursued beauty despite these costs because the rewards were substantial and because the penalties for failing to meet beauty standards were severe. The gendered nature of beauty standards, with women facing much more intense scrutiny and more rigid expectations than men, was a fundamental feature of medieval beauty systems. This gender imbalance reflected the patriarchal structure of medieval society and helped maintain male dominance by making female value dependent on physical appearance and on male approval of that appearance. Women were objectified and were taught to see themselves primarily as bodies to be looked at rather than as complete human beings. The connection between beauty and social class was also fundamental to how medieval beauty systems functioned. Beauty standards required resources to achieve, and this meant that nobles could look beautiful while commoners could not. The visible differences, gender expectations about female submissiveness. The taunt physical strength displayed by beautiful men reflected the importance of martial abilities. The pursuit of these beauty ideals required significant effort, expense, and often involved practices that were uncomfortable, painful, or dangerous. The toxic cosmetics, the extensive hair plucking, the restrictive clothing, the elaborate grooming routines, all of these demanded much from those who sought to be beautiful. Yet people pursued beauty despite these costs because the rewards were substantial and because the penalties for failing to meet beauty standards were severe. The gendered nature of beauty standards, with women facing much more intense scrutiny and more rigid expectations than men, was a fundamental feature of medieval beauty systems. This gender imbalance reflected the patriarchal structure of medieval society and helped maintain male dominance by making female value dependent on physical appearance and on male approval of that appearance. Women were objectified and were taught to see themselves primarily as bodies to be looked at rather than as complete human beings. The connection between beauty and social class was also fundamental to how medieval beauty systems functioned. Beauty standards required resources to achieve, and this meant that nobles could look beautiful while commoners could not. The visible differences loose. This gave beauty enormous importance and created intense pressure to conform to beauty standards. The consequences of medieval beauty standards for individuals were significant and often harmful. The pressure, the anxiety, the objectification, the physical harm from toxic cosmetics and painful practices, the discrimination against those who did not conform, all of these created suffering that was accepted as normal. Comparing medieval beauty standards to modern ones reveals both change and continuity. Modern standards are less rigid in some ways, with more acceptance of diversity. Modern cosmetics are safer. Modern fashion is less restrictive. However, the fundamental dynamic of beauty standards, creating pressure, affecting opportunities, and objectifying women persists. The specific ideals have changed, but the existence of ideals and their power to shape lives continues. Understanding medieval beauty standards in such exhaustive detail hopefully serves multiple purposes. It gives us historical knowledge about an important aspect of medieval culture. It helps us understand how beauty systems function more generally, and it provides perspective that might help us think more critically about our own beauty standards and their effects. As you finally drift off to sleep after this extremely long exploration of medieval beauty, you can rest knowing that you live in a time when beauty standards are somewhat less rigid and less directly connected to survival than they were in medieval times. You need never pluck your hairline back several inches. You need never apply poisonous lead to your face. You need never worry that your social value is determined entirely by your appearance, according to narrow and specific ideals. The medieval world with its elaborate beauty systems is gone, existing only in historical records and in very long, very boring sleep stories. The pale-faced ladies with their high foreheads and tiny mouths, the handsome knights with their noble bearing, the elaborate headdresses and the colorful gowns, all of these are images from a distant past. They are fascinating to study, but are not things we need to emulate or to judge ourselves against. Sleep well, dear listener, in your modern world where beauty, while still important, is defined more broadly and where your worth is not determined entirely by your appearance. The medieval mirror has been put away, and its narrow reflection no longer constrains us. Tomorrow you will wake in a world with different beauty standards, standards that have their own problems, but that are at least somewhat more humane than those faced by medieval people. Chapter 13. Daily Beauty Routines and Time Investment. To truly understand the burden of medieval beauty standards, we must examine in detail the daily routines that maintaining beauty required. The time investment alone was substantial, and for noble women especially, beauty maintenance could consume several hours each day. Let us walk through a typical day of beauty practices for a medieval noblewoman to appreciate the tedious, time-consuming nature of pursuing medieval beauty ideals. The day would begin upon waking, and the first task would be examining one's appearance in whatever mirror was available. Medieval mirrors were made of polished metal, not glass, and they provided dim, distorted reflections compared to modern mirrors. Nevertheless, the woman would inspect her face in this poor mirror, looking for any blemishes, freckles, or other imperfections that had appeared overnight or that needed attention. The morning washing routine would begin with a basin of water, which a servant would have brought and which might be warm if the household could afford the fuel to heat it. The woman would wash her face carefully, using a cloth and perhaps some mild soap if available. She would need to be gentle, as medieval soaps were harsh and could irritate skin. After washing, she would pat her face dry with a linen cloth, being careful not to rub roughly and cause redness or damage to the delicate skin. Next would come the application of morning cosmetics. If the woman used skin whitening preparations, she would apply them now, spreading the white paste or powder carefully over her face and neck. This application needed to be even and smooth, with no streaks or patches that would reveal the artificial nature of the pallor. The woman would need to allow time for the preparation to dry and set before proceeding to the next steps. After the whitening preparation had dried, rouge would be applied to the cheeks. The woman would use her fingers or perhaps a small piece of cloth to dab the red color onto her cheeks, blending it carefully to create a natural-looking flush. The application needed to be subtle, with just enough color to suggest a healthy bloom without looking painted or obvious. This required skill and practice, and a woman might spend several minutes working with the rouge to achieve the desired effect. The lips would receive similar treatment, with red coloring applied to create the small rosebud mouth that was ideal. Again, the application needed to be controlled and precise, as too much color would look vulgar while too little would leave the lips too pale. The edges of the lip color needed to be blended so that there was no obvious line between colored and uncolored skin. The eyebrows might need attention, as the thin, arched eyebrows that were fashionable required constant maintenance. The woman would check whether any hairs had grown back in areas that should be clear, and if so, she would pluck them using small tweezers. This plucking would be painful, as each hair would need to be grasped and pulled out by the root. The process might take 10 or 15 minutes if there were many hairs to remove, and the skin would be red and sore afterward. Hair care would be the most time-consuming part of the morning routine. If it was a day for hair washing, which might be once every 2 weeks or so, the process would take several hours from start to finish. Water would need to be heated, herbs or other additives would be prepared, and then the actual washing would begin. The woman's very long hair would be soaked in the washing mixture, worked through to remove dirt and oil, and then rinsed multiple times until all the washing solution was removed. After washing, the hair would need to dry, which could take an hour or more depending on its length and thickness. The woman might sit near a fire to speed the drying, or if weather permitted, she might sit in the sun. While waiting for her hair to dry, she might attend to other tasks, but she would need to remain relatively stationary and could not engage in any strenuous activity that might cause her to sweat and undo the cleaning work. Once the hair was dry, it would need to be combed thoroughly to remove any tangles and to ensure it was smooth and lustrous. A fine-tooth comb would be used to work through the hair from ends to roots, carefully separating any knots. This combing would also serve to remove any lice or nits, which were a constant problem and which required vigilant monitoring and removal. The combing process might take 30 minutes or more for very long, thick hair. The poch then be styled according to fashion and according to the day's activities. For a married woman, this typically meant braiding the hair and then covering it with veils or a headdress. Creating neat, even braids in one's own hair was difficult and time-consuming, and a woman of means would have a servant to help with this task. The braids needed to be tight enough to stay in place all day, but not so tight as to cause headaches. Once braided, the hair would be wound around the head or arranged in some other fashion, and then the veils or headdress would be positioned carefully and secured with pins. The selection and arrangement of the headdress was itself a time-consuming process. The headdress needed to be appropriate for the occasion, for the woman's status. It needed to be positioned correctly, sitting at the right angle and height. It needed to be secured firmly so it would not slip or fall during the day. For elaborate headdresses, like the hennin, the positioning and securing process could take 15 or 20 minutes and might require assistance from a servant. After hair and headdress were complete, attention would turn to clothing. The process of dressing in medieval garments was complex and time-consuming, as the multiple layers needed to be put on in the correct order and each needed to be arranged properly. The chemise would go on first, followed by the underdress, then the overdress if one was being worn, with each layer being smoothed and adjusted to hang correctly. Many medieval garments were not designed to be put on and removed easily by oneself, but required assistance. Lacing, buttons, and other fastenings might be positioned in the back where the wearer could not reach them. A servant would be needed to help with these fastenings, and the process of lacing a fitted dress could take 10 or 15 minutes, with the servant pulling the laces tight to create the desired fit. The belt or girdle would be positioned at the waist and would be arranged so that any decorative elements hung properly and so that any items attached to it were positioned conveniently. Jewelry would be selected and put on, with necklaces fastened, brooches pinned, and rings adjusted. Each piece of jewelry needed to be chosen to complement the outfit and to demonstrate appropriate status. The entire morning beauty and dressing routine might take 2 to 3 hours from start to finish, and this was time that could not be used for other activities. For a noblewoman who got necklaces fastened, brooches pinned, and rings adjusted, each piece of jewelry needed to be chosen to complement the outfit and to demonstrate appropriate status. The entire morning beauty and dressing routine might take 2 to 3 hours from start to finish, and this was time that could not be used for other activities. For a noble woman who was not expected to do productive labor, this time investment was manageable, but it still represented a significant portion of her waking hours dedicated solely to appearance maintenance. Throughout the day, the woman would need to monitor and maintain her appearance. She would need to avoid activities that would cause her to sweat and ruin her cosmetics. She would need to be careful not to disarrange her hair or dislodge her headdress. She would need to move carefully to avoid damaging her clothing or getting it dirty. The constant vigilance required to maintain appearance would be mentally exhausting and would limit her activities and her spontaneity. By evening, the cosmetics might need to be refreshed, particularly if there had been any special activities or events. The woman would reapply rouge if it had faded, would check her hair and headdress for any disarray, and would make sure her clothing was still properly arranged. This evening refresh might take 30 minutes or more. At bedtime, the process would reverse. The headdress would be removed carefully and stored properly. The hair would be unbraided and combed out, which would take time and care. The clothing would be removed layer by layer, with assistance needed for the fastenings that could not be reached independently. The cosmetics would be wiped off with cloths and water, though complete removal was difficult, and many women probably slept with residual cosmetics still on their faces. The cumulative time investment over a week or a month would be enormous. If we estimate 3 hours each morning for the complete beauty routine, plus another 30 minutes in the evening, that would be 3.5 hours per day, or 24.5 hours per week, or nearly 100 hours per month spent solely on beauty maintenance. This is the equivalent of more than 12 full 8-hour workdays each month spent on appearance, time that could not be spent on other activities. For common women who did not have servants and parents who needed to work, this level of time investment was impossible. They would need to maintain their appearance as best they could, with minimal time and resources, washing their faces quickly in cold water, braiding their hair simply, and dressing in simple garments that could be managed without assistance. Their inability to spend hours on beauty maintenance would be visible and would mark them as lower class. Understanding the daily time investment required by medieval beauty standards helps us appreciate that beauty was not a casual concern, but was serious work that consumed significant portions of women's time and attention. The pursuit of beauty was a demanding job in itself, one that left little energy or time for other pursuits. Chapter 14: Beauty Advice and Instructional Texts. Medieval people who wanted to improve their beauty could turn to various advice texts and instructional materials that provided detailed guidance on beauty practices. These texts reveal much about medieval attitudes toward beauty and about the specific practices that were recommended. Let us examine some of these advice texts and the guidance they provided. Medical texts written by physicians and scholars would include sections on maintaining health and appearance. As the two were considered closely related, these texts would explain the humoral theory of medicine and would provide advice on diet, lifestyle, and treatments that would maintain proper balance and thus preserve or enhance beauty. A medical text might advise that women who wanted to maintain pale skin should avoid foods that increased heat in the body, such as spicy foods, strong wines, and red meats. Instead, they should eat cooling foods, including cucumbers, lettuce, fish, and white meats. The theory was that heating foods would increase blood flow to the skin and would create a ruddy complexion, while cooling foods would maintain the pale, cool complexion that was ideal. These texts would also provide recipes for various beauty preparations. A typical text might include dozens of recipes for different purposes, including skin whitening, freckle removal, hair care, tooth cleaning, and breath rationing. The recipes would list the joint ingredients, which might include common substances available locally or might include expensive, exotic materials. The preparation instructions would be detailed, explaining how to combine and prepare the ingredients. Some recipes included in medical texts would actually be harmful, containing toxic substances like mercury or lead. The texts would not warn about these dangers, as the toxicity was not understood or was believed to be outweighed by the benefits. Other recipes would be relatively harmless but probably ineffective, containing ingredients that would have no real impact on the conditions they were supposed to treat. Religious conduct books, written for the moral instruction of women, would address beauty in more ambivalent terms. These texts would acknowledge that women needed to maintain appropriate appearance, but would warn against excessive vanity and against using beauty arts for sinful purposes, such as attracting illicit male attention. A religious conduct book might advise that a woman should keep herself clean and neat, should wear clothing appropriate to her station, and should maintain modest and decorous appearance. However, it would warn against spending too much time on beautification, against using cosmetics too obviously, and against wearing overly elaborate or revealing clothing. The woman should aim to please her husband and to avoid bringing shame to her family, but she should not seek to attract admiring look from other men. These conduct books would often cite biblical passages and stories of saints to support their advice. They would mention women who had been punished for vanity or who had been rewarded for modesty. The overall message was that beauty was acceptable but must be pursued with restraint and with proper motivation. Courtly love literature and poetry, while not explicitly instructional, provided models of ideal beauty that readers would absorb and would try to emulate. The detailed descriptions of beautiful heroines would teach readers what features to value and what appearance to strive for. Women reading these texts would compare themselves to the described ideals and would modify their own appearance practices accordingly. Secular advice texts written for noble and wealthy audiences would be more explicit in their beauty guidance and would be less concerned with religious constraints. These texts would assume that readers had resources to spend on beauty and would provide detailed instructions on achieving fashionable appearance. Such a text might include extensive advice on clothing selection, explaining which fabrics, colors, and styles were most fashionable, which were appropriate for different occasions, and which would be most flattering for different body types and coloring. The text would describe current fashion trends and would explain how to achieve them. The text would also include cosmetic recipes and instructions, providing multiple options for each purpose so that readers could choose based on ingredient availability and personal preference. The recipes might be introduced with claims about their effectiveness, perhaps noting that they had been used by famous beauties or that they had been proven through long experience. Instructions for hair care and styling would be particularly detailed in secular advice texts. The text would explain different braiding techniques, would describe how to create fashionable hairstyles, and would provide tips for maintaining hair health and beauty. They might include illustrations or diagrams showing how hair should be arranged, though such illustrations would be simple and might not convey all the necessary details. Some advice texts were written in the form of dialogues or conversations, with an experienced older woman instructing a younger woman in beauty practices. This format made the advice seem more personal and more trustworthy, as if it were being passed down within a family rather than being abstract instruction from an unknown author. The advice in these dialogues would cover not just specific beauty practices, but also general principles about appearance, maintenance, and about the proper attitudes toward beauty. The older woman might explain that beauty was a gift from God that should be appreciated and maintained, but also that beauty should be used wisely and should not become an obsession or a source of pride. Household management texts written for women who were managing estates or large households, would include sections on beauty maintenance among their other practical advice. These texts would provide recipes for making various beauty preparations at home, would explain how to store and preserve cosmetics and perfumes, and would offer guidance on when and how to use them. These household texts would be practical and economy-minded, providing options that used readily available ingredients rather than expensive imports. They would explain how to prepare large batches of commonly used items like soap or hair washing solutions that could be stored and used over time. They would provide tips for making supplies last longer and for substituting cheaper ingredients when necessary. The existence of all these advice texts demonstrates that medieval people took beauty seriously and sought guidance on how to achieve it. The text also show that there was a literate audience interested in such advice and willing to read or listen to these materials. Beauty was not merely a matter of instinct or tradition, but was a subject of study and instruction. However, the advice provided in these texts was not always accurate or helpful. Some recommendations were based on faulty theories about the body and about how appearance could be modified. Some recipes contained useless or harmful ingredients. Some fashion advice would quickly become outdated as styles changed. Following ingredients, the advice in these texts did not guarantee beauty success, but did at least provide some structure and guidance for people navigating the complex world of medieval beauty standards. Chapter 15. Beauty failures, disasters, and cautionary tales. Not everyone who pursued medieval beauty standards successfully achieved them, and the failures and disasters that could result from beauty practices formed their own genre of stories and cautionary tales. let us examine what could go wrong in the pursuit of medieval beauty and how these failures were perceived and discussed. The most serious beauty disasters involved the toxic cosmetics that were commonly used. Women who regularly applied skin whitening preparations containing white lead would gradually poison themselves, often without realizing what was causing their declining health. The symptoms of lead poisoning would develop slowly and would include fatigue, weakness, digestive problems, neurological issues, and eventually more serious damage to the brain and organs. As the poisoning progressed, the woman would ironically begin to look worse rather than better, with her skin taking on a grayish cast, her eyes becoming dull, and her overall appearance becoming haggard. She might continue using the lead cosmetics, thinking that she needed even more to cover the signs of ill health, thus worsening the poisoning. Eventually, if the use continued for years, the woman might die from the accumulated toxic effects. Mercury compounds, which were also used in some cosmetics, would cause similar gradual poisoning, with neurological damage being particularly prominent. Women who used mercury-containing preparations might develop tremors, memory problems, and personality changes. Their teeth might loosen and fall out. Their hair might thin or fall out. Again, the very preparations meant to enhance beauty would destroy it, and would ultimately destroy health and life. Stories and warnings about women who had poisoned themselves with cosmetics would circulate, creating anxiety about beauty practices while not actually stopping them. The desire for beauty was so strong and the social pressure to achieve it was so intense that women would continue using dangerous substances despite knowing the risks. The warning stories would be tragic, but would not be sufficient to change behavior. Other beauty disasters were less life-threatening, but still serious. Overzealous hair plucking could cause infections, scarring, and permanent damage to the blonde hair follicles. Women who plucked their blonde hairlines back too far might create hairlines that looked strange and unnatural. The constant plucking could cause chronic irritation and pain, and if tools were not clean, infections could develop. Hair dyeing attempts could go badly wrong. Preparations meant to lighten hair might instead turn it green, orange, or a strange brassy color. Hair form might become damaged and brittle from harsh chemical treatments. In severe cases, hair might actually fall out from the damage. A woman whose hair dyeing attempt failed would face weeks or months of having strange colored or damaged hair, as there would be no easy fix. Clothing disasters were also possible. Expensive fabrics could be ruined by stains that could not be removed, by tears or burns that could not be properly repaired, or by moths that ate holes in stored garments. A noblewoman who ruined an expensive dress through carelessness or bad luck would face financial loss and would lack appropriate attire for important occasions. Fashion mistakes were another form of beauty failure. A woman who adopted a style that did not suit her or who wore clothing inappropriate for her station would be criticized and mocked. The complex rules about what could be worn by different classes and what was appropriate for different occasions created many opportunities for error, and those who made mistakes would face social consequences. The wrong colors for one's complexion could make one look ill or washed out. Proportions that were unflattering would emphasize flaws rather than minimizing them. Styles that were too young or too old for one's age would seem ridiculous. All of these fashion failures would be noticed and commented upon, creating embarrassment and damage to reputation. Cosmetic application errors were common. Rouge applied too heavily would create an obvious painted look that would be considered vulgar. Skin whitening preparations that were applied unevenly would create a patchy, strange appearance. Lip color that feathered or bled outside the lip line would look messy and would suggest either incompetence or low-class origin. Headdress disasters could occur when elaborate head coverings were not secured properly and would slip, tilt, or fall off entirely. This would be mortifying in public and would create disorder in the hair that would be difficult to fix without assistance. A woman whose headdress fell off would be the subject of gossip and amusement. Physical flaws could not always be concealed through beauty practices. Scars, birthmarks, missing teeth, crooked features, and other imperfections might remain visible, despite all efforts to hide or minimize them. Women with such flaws would be constantly aware of their deficiency and would face criticism and reduced marriage prospects. The aging process would eventually defeat even the most dedicated beauty efforts. As women aged, their skin would lose smoothness and elasticity, wrinkles would appear, teeth would be lost, hair would thin and gray, and the overall appearance of youth and beauty would fade. This inevitable decline would be a source of anxiety and grief, as women would see their social value diminishing along with their looks. Cautionary tales about beauty disasters would emphasize the vanity and foolishness of excessive concern with appearance. Stories would tell of women who bankrupted their families spending money on cosmetics and fashion, of women who made themselves ill through extreme beauty practices, of women who were punished by God for their vanity. These tales would serve to reinforce the religious teaching that excessive concern with physical beauty was sinful. However, these cautionary tales existed alongside the continuing social reality that beauty mattered enormously, and that women who were not beautiful faced serious disadvantages. The moral lesson that beauty should not be pursued too zealously conflicted with the practical reality that beauty was necessary for success. This contradiction created confusion and anxiety for women trying to navigate between religious propriety and social necessity. The fear of beauty disasters would add another layer of stress to the already difficult process of maintaining appearance according to medieval standards. Women would worry not just about whether they were beautiful enough, but also about whether their beauty practices might go wrong in ways that would make them look worse or that would damage their health. Yet, the alternative of not pursuing beauty was equally unacceptable, so they would continue despite the risks and despite the anxiety. Good night, and may you dream peacefully, free from the anxieties of medieval beauty standards.